She called 911 on Easter morning, said I was illegally manipulating fish flow while I was baptizing trout for the neighborhood kids. Name's Tolland Mercer. I've lived on parcel 12 since '91. There's a laminated folder in my desk labeled Water Rights, Read if Harassed. Ever watched someone weaponize a megaphone against a pond? What's the pettiest misuse of power you've ever witnessed? So, let me get this straight, Deputy Clay said, squinting under his cap. She called 911 because you were moving fish. I stood barefoot in the grass, holding a net still dripping from the last bucket. The trout swam in lazy circles in their new tank behind me, sunlight flickering off their silver backs. It wasn't even 9 a.m., and already I felt like the punchline of a joke no one else got. Across the lawn, Eileen Casterbridge stood high on her wraparound porch, draped in a pearl-colored robe that shimmered in the morning sun. Her hands were on her hips like she was starring in a courtroom drama, except the only jury around was Deputy Clay and a stray golden retriever chewing a stick near the hedges. She's worried about ecological terrorism, I said, trying not to laugh. Apparently, I'm now a danger to the wetlands. Deputy Clay grunted, not amused. He took the folded document I handed him, the edges softened from years in my desk drawer. It was my land survey, clear as daylight, stamped and dated. Parcel 12. Mercer Holdings, including the spring-fed pond I'd just harvested the trout from. Clay turned it over, rubbed his thumb across the faded blue ink. This is your pond. Tolland, I nodded. Bought it with the house. 5 years ago. Fed by an underground spring and filtered through a closed-loop aquaponics system I designed myself. Clay gave a low whistle. Fancy. Eileen didn't mention any of that when she called. She rarely mentions facts I said. Just feelings. He squinted up at the porch. Eileen hadn't moved, but I could feel her eyes drilling into my neck like a set of hot coals. Her robe flapped a little in the breeze, and I noticed she was wearing pearls, real ones probably, always ready for a performance. What exactly did she tell dispatch, I asked. Clay flipped open his notepad. Male subject possibly unlicensed relocating live fish to unknown containment units. Potential EPA violation. Environmental threat to HOA wetlands and bird migration zone. I blinked. Bird migration? Apparently she thinks your fish tanks might attract osprey. I looked over at the 300-gallon tanks lined up behind the shed, bubbling gently like oversized bathtubs. If an osprey shows up here, I'll name it after her. Clay snorted, then cleared his throat. Mind if I walk the property line? Be my guest. We walked along the trimmed hedge, the border where my yard met the common lot. Clay stopped beside a wooden stake marked with orange tape, then looked back toward the pond. Eileen's under the impression the HOA controls water features. They do, I said, except when they're on private land. Page 19, paragraph 3, line 7. Clay arched a brow. You memorize the bylaws? Some people play golf. I read contracts. He chuckled, then turned to wave Eileen down from her perch. Ma'am, you might want to come hear this. She descended slowly, each step like she was balancing on stage lights. Her slippers barely touched the stone path. Yes, Clay held up the survey. He owns the lake, ma'am. Eileen's lips tightened until they nearly disappeared. She didn't respond, just stared at me as if I'd taken something she hadn't offered. Clay handed the paper back to me and tipped his hat. You're clear, Mr. Mercer. Just maybe give the neighborhood a heads up next time you do anything flashy. Moving fish is flashy now, these days. Who knows? He turned and walked back toward his cruiser. I stood there, paper in hand, trout tank humming behind me. Eileen lingered a few seconds more, her gaze full of fury and something else calculation. Then she muttered, barely loud enough for me to hear. Not for long. The fine arrived 2 days later, tucked inside an envelope that smelled faintly of lavender. That was Eileen's touch. No doubt she always scented her correspondence as if even bureaucratic punishment should feel artisanal. The paper itself was heavy, stock cream-colored and printed in a font I'd only seen on retirement party invitations. At the top, the HOA's logo, a stylized blue heron standing on a cattail. Below the charge, unauthorized aquatic disturbance, $250. No explanation, no statute. Just that phrase floating in the middle like it had always been law. I sat at my home office desk staring at it while the hum of the printer cooled. Outside, the trees were leafing up into full spring dogwoods, pinking at the edges. But my room still smelled like soil toner and something deeper memory, maybe. I scanned the letter and opened a new email. Short, polite. Dear HOA Board, please find attached a certified land survey confirming private ownership of Parcel 12 and the spring-fed pond therein. Kindly review and clarify which provision I've allegedly violated. Best regards, T. Mercer. I attached the document's survey water use notice from 2016, even a receipt for the trout stock from the aquaponics supplier. Clicked send. Then I sat back and stared at the old lockbox near my feet. It was fireproof metal and ugly. The handle creaked when I lifted it onto the desk. I hadn't opened it since my father's funeral. Inside were manila folders labeled in my handwriting: taxes, deeds, architectural plans for the greenhouse. Near the bottom I found the one I was looking for: WR Irrigation Agreement, 1991. The pages smelled like basement paper ink and time. I flipped through them, not expecting much. Then I found it a yellowing deed with my own signature scribbled hastily 20 years ago when I first bought the land. And just above that in the fine print a clause: all irrigation access contingent upon agreement with parcel owner. I leaned back. My office chair let out a tired sigh. So it wasn't just mine in spirit, it was mine on record legally. The water rights weren't merely incidental, they were central, and every valve, spigot, and trench running from the reservoir owed its permission to one person. Me. I stood, walked out to the side deck. Rue was there leaning against the rail with his phone in hand. "You seen this?" he said without looking up. He handed me his screen, a screenshot of the HOA's Facebook page. Eileen had posted a photo of me holding Annette's son in my eyes. "Water thief at large." The caption read. Underneath 3 comments from neighbors. One asked if I had the proper EPA permits. Another offered to contact the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. The third posted a trout emoji and the words, "Next HOA meeting, gonna be spicy." I handed the phone back silent. Rue just shook his head. "They're making it sound like you poisoned the water," he said. "Give it time," I replied. "They'll accuse me of raising sharks next." He laughed, then turned serious. "You gonna let it go?" I didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, I went back inside, returned to the lockbox, and pulled the folder fully onto the desk. I clicked a pen, labeled one tab, Usage Clauses, another Transfer of Access, then a third, HOA Dependency. Sticky notes lined the edges, now a rainbow of quiet resistance. No dramatic speeches, no midnight calls to lawyers, just a man with a printer, a memory, and a box full of documents. Some people fight fire with fire. I preferred paper. "You're about 3 days late," Byron said, setting down his iced tea. "I've been expecting you." The porch creaked as I stepped onto the third plank, the one that always gave a little more than it should. Kudzu vines had started climbing the posts again, curling like slow fingers around the railings. Byron Meeks hadn't trimmed them since Easter, but somehow they made the place feel more alive. "You knew I'd come?" I asked, settling into the folding chair beside him. He didn't answer directly, just took a sip of tea, eyes half-lidded against the afternoon glare. His mailbox, rusted and leaning sideways, still bore the name Meeks in faded stencil. Nothing fancy about Byron, not in the way he dressed, spoke, or let time sit undisturbed on his land. I figured he said eventually. "Once Eileen got her claws into the bylaws, you'd start digging." I handed him the scanned version of the 1991 agreement on a thumb drive. "Thought you might want a copy." Byron didn't even look at it. Instead, he reached beneath his chair, pulled out a 3-ring binder, and thudded it onto the little glass table between us. The spine was cracked. The cover had yellowed where stickers used to be. He opened it to a page marked with a sticky tab. There, preserved in a sheet protector, was the original signed Water Rights Agreement ink, slightly smudged corners curled but legible. "Why am I not surprised?" I murmured. "You shouldn't be," Byron said. "I wrote half of it." I leaned forward. "Wait, you're the BM watermark on the top page." He nodded. "Back when I was still doing consulting for the county. Eileen was new then, back when she still wore denim and said, 'Please.'" I smiled. "Long time ago. She never read the fine print, you know, just assumed the reservoir was common property." Byron flipped to the key clause, tapping it with a thick finger. HOA, Irrigation Dependency on Parcel 12 contingent upon owner's consent. It was so plainly written I wondered how no one had noticed. Or maybe they had and just hoped I never would. 31 years, he said, chuckling. "She's been borrowing from you for 3 decades, never paid a dime, and now she's got the nerve to fine you for stirring your own water. Feels about right." He poured me a glass of tea. It was too sweet as always, but welcome in the May heat. We sat a while listening to birdsong and the faint whir of a weed trimmer from the house next door. Eventually, I asked, "Would it hold up?" "Legally," Byron snorted. "Son, it's stamped 3 times. County, state, and HOA itself. They'd need a time machine to wiggle out of it. I nodded, but my mind was already running. If I was right, the HOA's entire irrigation plan sprinklers shared garden beds. Even the fountain at the entrance was fed at least partially from a system that began on my land. I didn't need to go nuclear. Not yet. But I did need to prepare. Back home, Rue was in my office with a flatbed scanner and a pair of gloves. His idea. I don't want to smudge history, he joked, but I appreciated the care. He digitized every page of Byron's binder, cross-referenced it with my own records, and labeled them all. We backed the files up onto flash drives, one for me, one for a safe deposit box, and a third for insurance. Before Rue left, he handed me the original drive. "You gonna send it to them?" "Not yet," I said. "Let them build their case a little higher." Rue nodded. "You're playing the long game. I've always been fond of irrigation metaphors." When he was gone, I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside, among tax receipts and a half-used pack of graph paper, I slid in a new folder. On its tab, I wrote carefully, HOA. Do not open unless provoked. It wasn't war, not yet, but I'd started lining my trenches. Eileen's voice rang through a borrowed megaphone. Our lake is dying under corporate tyranny. I was trimming back cattails when the first cheer went up from the HOA green. From the slope of my driveway, I could see the whole setup: a folding table covered in teal cloth, a pitcher of cucumber water sweating in the Arkansas sun, and a stack of T-shirts reading "Save Our Shared Spring" in cursive font. Eileen stood center stage, well, actually on an overturned recycling bin. Her silk scarf fluttered like a flag, and her hair had been teased into a volume I hadn't seen since prom photos from 1978. She gestured dramatically, pacing like a televangelist in capri pants. Behind her, Gerald, who once got winded assembling a grill, was awkwardly handing out flyers to passers-by. Most of them were neighbors who'd shown up for the snacks and stayed for the spectacle. I wiped my hands on a rag and leaned on the handle of the shovel. Next to me, the newly installed filtration pipe gleamed just finished. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. "This is not just about algae," Eileen boomed. "This is about arrogance." Murmurs of agreement rippled across the folding chairs. I spotted Rue in the back arms, crossed lips tight. Two kids tossed pine cones near the koi fountain. I didn't see Sarah Ledge until much later, standing off to the side, phone low, thumb tapping the screen slowly. Eileen pointed toward my property. "He may own the deed, but we own the soul of this neighborhood." More clapping. I watched a T-shirt slide off the stack and drift onto the grass. No one picked it up. That night, the first letter came, tucked into my mailbox with no stamp. The envelope was printed with faint roses and sealed with a monogram sticker. I opened it at the kitchen counter halfway through boiling lentils. "Cease and desist," it read, in swirling cursive. Regarding unauthorized installation of industrial piping. Violations of Section 4A of Water Ethics Charter. Remedy: required immediate cessation and visual reversal. Signed, Eileen Casterbridge, HOA, President, CC Community Wellness Team. The paper smelled like peonies. I filed it in a manila folder labeled Creative Writing. 2 days later, a second envelope arrived, this one tied with twine. New allegations. Emotional harm via visual disruption of natural landscape. No legal seal, no actual demand. Just more adjectives. I said nothing. Didn't post, didn't reply. I just went out the next morning and reseeded the sediment trap under the eastern outflow. I added gravel, leveled the retaining net, checked the outflow pH, and logged the number. Eileen returned to the green every Thursday. Her megaphone developed a rattle by week 3, but she didn't seem to notice. I noticed the crowd had thinned. Gerald was now alone at the table, sipping cucumber water, offering flyers to uninterested joggers. That was when the third letter came. This one arrived via Gerald himself, delivered by hand, his cheeks pink, eyes apologetic. "Sorry, Tolland," he mumbled. She insisted I bring it in person. I took it with a nod. The envelope was scented with something stronger this time. Lavender, maybe? Inside, cease and desist. Final notice. Charge irreparable. Aquatic damage. Observed symptoms. Algal, distress. Visual distress, communal distrust. Requested action. Formal apology, full water audit, re-education. I read it twice, then set it on the kitchen counter beside the kettle. My smile must have startled Gerald. "Irreparable aquatic damage," I said. "That's new." He chuckled nervously. "She's got a thesaurus, I think. You want coffee?" He declined and all but ran back to the sidewalk. Later that night, I stepped outside to check the timer on the UV clarifier. My yard was quiet pond reflecting a sky just starting to think about stars. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text. From Sarah Ledge. One word, recording. No punctuation, no context. But I knew what it meant. I opened the file. Eileen's voice, clear as day, caught mid-rant during last Thursday's rally. He's a tyrant with algae ambitions. Always was. You think he's doing this for purity? He wants control. I watched the waveform on the screen shift with every syllable. Then I pressed pause. Sometimes you don't need a counterattack. You just need to let someone talk long enough. Blue lights flashed against my rain barrels as Deputy Clay stepped out of his cruiser for the second time in a month. The morning had been humid, but quiet. I just tightened the pressure valve on the upper pump line when the patrol car rolled up gravel, cracking under its tires. Clay's boots landed in sync with the cruiser door slamming shut. He adjusted his belt and looked at me like I'd called him. I hadn't. I assume this isn't a social visit, I said. Nope, he replied, jaw working a peppermint. Got another call. I didn't need to ask from whom. From across the cul-de-sac, Eileen's porch glared with throw pillows and indignation. Her megaphone rested beside her, replaced now with a clipboard and a thermal mug that probably wasn't filled with tea. Her fingers danced on the edge of the railing like a pianist before a performance. She says, "You're draining the reservoir," Clay said. Allegedly. I motioned toward the pump, still humming as usual, burbling steady through its filters. That's the same pump it's always been. No drainage. Just flow balancing after yesterday's rain. Clay squinted toward the pond. Looks peaceful enough. I walked into the garage, came back with a leather-bound folder labeled in red ink, HOA. Enforcement Response. I handed it to him, page open to the 1991 agreement. His eyes skimmed the first paragraph, then the next. I stood silent. So did Rue, perched on her porch across the street, holding her phone like she was texting but angling the camera just right. Clay cleared his throat. Parcel 12. Mercer Holdings is the source of primary irrigation to Willow Ridge Preserve, he read aloud. Access granted under 30-year lease, signed March 1991, renewable by default unless terminated by Parcel 12 owner. He flipped to the next page, my property deed notarized and recertified in 2017. Then, a laminated map color-coded with water lines in blue and property boundaries in yellow. It was all tabbed, all ready. Ma'am, Clay said, turning to Eileen without lifting his boots off my gravel. You're accusing him of draining water that comes from his own land. Eileen sputtered. But this affects the entire community. That reservoir, Clay didn't blink, is fed by a spring under Parcel 12. The HOA's irrigation pulls from it. Always has. But, her voice rose an octave. He's tampering. He installed unauthorized systems. He installed maintenance systems, Clay replied. Which by this he waved the folder gently, he's well within his rights to do. Behind her, Franklin Oak had emerged, arms crossed, eyes narrowed beneath silver-framed glasses. He said nothing, just watched. Clay turned back to me. Any plans to alter flow capacity beyond standard thresholds? No, sir, I said. Everything's within historical rate tolerances. He nodded, handed the folder back. Looks like you've got your paperwork in a row. Eileen had gone silent. Not in defeat, but in stunned suspension like a performer who'd missed her cue. I'd advise you both, Clay added to keep correspondence civil. But from where I'm standing, there's no violation here. He tipped his cap and walked back toward his cruiser, mumbling something about needing stronger coffee. I stayed where I was, folder tucked under my arm, the hum of the pump behind me. Rue gave me a tiny thumbs up from across the street. Franklin turned and walked back inside his house, no words exchanged. Eileen sat slowly on her porch swing. The chains creaked under her. Her clipboard lay limp across her lap. She stared ahead, not at me, not at the pump, just ahead. The swing rocked, but she didn't. The cruiser pulled away. No siren, no urgency. Inside my house, I placed the folder back into the lockbox. Tucked behind it was the flash drive Rue had given me, labeled in Sharpie full contract plus HOA footage. I closed the lid gently. I clicked the slide forward. The words on screen were simple. Section 4 termination. 48 hours notice. A collective murmur passed through the room like someone had turned the AC on high. The Willow Ridge Community Hall had never been this full, not even during the summer potluck or the Easter raffle. Every seat was taken, and folks lined the back wall with crossed arms and skeptical eyes. Byron Meeks leaned against the window frame, arms folded the same rust-colored tie he wore when the county honored him still knotted neatly at his collar. Sarah Ledge stood near the light-switch laptop bag zipped tight at her feet. Her eyes locked on me with the same focus she used when balancing checkbooks for half the neighborhood. Eileen sat 3 rows back, flanked by Gerald and a woman I only knew as Marnie from Unit 6. Her jaw was already set, shoulders stiff in a lemon-yellow blouse that looked like it came with marching orders. I adjusted my glasses, took one breath, and began. My name is Toland Mercer. Most of you know me. I've lived on Parcel 12 for 14 years. You've seen the pumps, the barrels, the koi once or twice. There were polite chuckles. A few didn't smile. I clicked again. Slide 2, a scanned page from the 1991 WR Irrigation Agreement. This agreement, signed by the HOA and my predecessor, outlines the use of my spring-fed pond for community irrigation. It renews automatically every 5 years unless either party terminates with 48 hours written notice. Click. Slide 3. Highlighted clause in yellow termination by parcel owner requires minimum 48 hours written notice. I let the silence stretch. I've submitted that notice effective this morning. Eileen bolted upright. This is blackmail. No, ma'am, I said, still steady. This is enforcement. You escalated this public accusations fine, cease and desists. I didn't retaliate. I documented. I filed. You can't just shut off water, I said, clicking again. The next slide showed the topographic overlay of the spring and irrigation grid. Unless we come to terms. Franklin Oak cleared his throat from the end of the row 2, arms crossed. Terms I'm willing to renegotiate, I replied. We draft a new agreement, fair mutual with oversight. You rescind all prior fines and drop active complaints. In exchange, water flow continues uninterrupted. This is extortion, Eileen spat. Sarah stepped forward. Can I play something? All eyes turned. She held up her phone speaker toward the ceiling. A scratch of static, then Eileen's voice clear as a church bell. I know it's his damn pond, but if we keep saying it's shared, he'll crack. He's soft. Silence. Eileen's face drained of color. That recording, Byron said, was obtained in a public rally. Perfectly admissible. I nodded to him. And this, I held up the laminated agreement, is legal. The HOA's irrigation depends entirely on cooperation with Parcel 12. That hasn't changed in 27 years. Franklin stood. Let's vote. One by one, hands went up. Rue's, then Byron's, then nearly everyone's. Eileen's hands stayed clenched on her knees. The ayes have it, Franklin said, turning to me. We'll accept your terms. Let's move forward. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then we begin renegotiations. Effective now. The sprinklers stopped first. Then the koi fountains fell silent. It took most folks in Willow Ridge a full day to notice. A dry patch on the Henderson lawn. A curious stillness near the west garden beds. I kept to my routine, checked the pump pressure, turned the main valve an eighth clockwise, and walked back inside without a word. The silence wasn't spite. It was structure. That same afternoon, I received a thick envelope from Byron, postmarked 2 days prior. His handwriting still held the same ridged elegance and almost calligraphic patience. Inside, notarized documentation confirming enforcement of Section 4. Attached was a handwritten note, enforcement complete. New contract pending. The weight is no longer yours alone. Byron. I placed it beside the old folder, now bloated with sticky notes and color-coded tabs. For the first time in weeks, I let myself sit with it. Not just the paper, but the relief. The kind of quiet that feels earned. Eileen's resignation came the next morning. I received a forwarded copy from Rue, who'd started volunteering to digitize HOA paperwork for transparency. The email was short-typed in size 16 Georgia font, her signature enlarged to an almost theatrical scale. Effective immediately, I resigned from the Willow Ridge HOA board under protest and duress. Eileen Casterbridge. The words were defensive, but the act itself, that was surrender. A few days later, Gerald caught me near the mail kiosk. He wasn't wearing one of his usual HOA polos, just a soft flannel and weathered jeans. He looked tired. He handed me a small envelope and said, "Only, she won't say it, but I will." Then he nodded once and walked away. Inside was a gift card to the local nursery and a handwritten line for the water, for the patients. Sarah swung by 2 evenings later, dropping off a USB loaded with final clips and community statements. She'd added soft subtitles to Eileen's rally footage, muted but clear, the kind of edit that didn't scream revenge, just record. Rue had started drafting a proposal for the HOA's winter newsletter asking if I'd submit a small statement. I hadn't decided yet. Words after all this felt like water capable of healing or erosion. That weekend, Byron returned this time in person. We sat on the back porch with iced tea and silence. After a long sip, he passed over a manila folder with the new HOA agreement. I added one line he said. I scanned through. Near the end, just above the signatures, no member shall engage in direct harassment of the water lessor. I chuckled. Poetic. You've earned some poetry, he said, raising his glass. I signed. The next morning, I walked the stone path to the pond. The surface was calm, touched by breeze the way it always had been before all this noise. I sat on the bench beneath the sycamore and opened my notebook. I began sketching. A small plaque. Simple. Bronze, maybe, mounted near the pump housing. One line only, water flows where respect begins. The plaque caught the morning light like it knew it was being watched. Water graciously provided by Trout Mercer. Please don't make him mad. Sarah had insisted on the last part, claiming it would keep folks humble. I'd only smiled and agreed. Humor, after all, goes further than fences. It was spring again, 6 years to the month since trout buckets and megaphones had turned my gravel driveway into a battleground. Now, willow branches leaned toward the water like old friends. The HOA had finally approved funds for a new triple filtration system per the restructured agreement. The pond sparkled more than it had in decades. Most mornings I walked the path alone, but today was Saturday. Rue had already set up the awning for the farm stand stocked with Kale Bunch's jars of pickled okra and 6 pounds of trout packed in shaved ice. She waved from beneath her straw hat as I approached. First customer already came by, she called. Wanted kale and gossip. I gave her half. Byron sat on the bench under the sycamore sipping from a thermos and feeding a squirrel a piece of cornbread. He looked like he'd been carved from the wood he sat on, solid worn and not in a hurry to be anything else. Maudine Bell arrived with a carload of kids from the school. They were part of the new Waterways Awareness Club. I'd offered to give a short tour of the irrigation outflow paths, nothing too technical. One of the younger ones, maybe 7 or 8, lingered behind while the others fanned out toward the compost station. She stood in front of the sign, her head tilted. "Are you the man who owns all the water?" she asked, eyes wide. I crouched beside her. The gravel crunched under my knee. "No, honey," I said, glancing at the plaque. "I just take care of it better than they did." She nodded once satisfied and ran to join her group. Behind us, Eileen strolled the loop trail as she did every morning now. She wore oversized sunglasses and kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, never once glancing toward the pond or the sign. Her blog, Succulent Freedom, had 12 followers last I checked. She'd pivoted to cacti and passive-aggressive bonsai pruning tips. I suppose it was better than silence. Later that afternoon, Rue and I planted a sapling river birch, her favorite, near the footbridge. We buried a small copper plaque in the soil nearby. It read, Community Fund Project, Est, 2024. It wasn't a grand gesture, just roots, earth, and metal, but it meant something. The water still flowed. The papers were in order. The anger had quieted. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it settles like silt, gradual, inevitable, quietly making the whole thing stronger. The birch tree by the footbridge has started to lean toward the pond just slightly, like it's listening. Most mornings now I sit beside it with a thermos and watch the trout stir under glassy water. The plaque hasn't tarnished. The silence feels earned. Sometimes justice doesn't show up in courtrooms. Sometimes it comes through paperwork patience and a filter system that finally works. Funny thing about control, it only feels heavy when you're holding it too tight. If you've ever been pushed too far or silenced by someone louder, just remember still water can hold more truth than noise ever will. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Share it below or stick around for the next story.